All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. All right, ending off the course here with a little look at the future. And here it's going to be a little bit on the general side in terms of the future of religion, with some, light commentary on youth issues on my part. All right, so what we should all be aware of is that any kind of forecasting that goes particularly far out is absolutely a mug's game, right? Like any predictions are likely to be inaccurate. They're likely to be full of mistakes, but nevertheless, Pew Research Center has put together sort of some estimates of religion that I think are kind of interesting. And I will say, right, like if we'd been in 1990, kind of at the height of evangelicalism, and where America was a pretty religious nation, no one would have predicted the rise of the nuns or the unaffiliated in the way that it has happened. Okay. However, if Pew's modeling is accurate up to the middle of the 20th century, in the U.S., Christianity will remain the dominant faith. The majority of the population will remain Christian, and the growth of the nuns will sort of taper off, right? It's going to essentially flatten out at about a quarter of the population, right? With everybody else sort of growing, Muslims reaching about 2.1%, but basically, it's Christian. It will remain Christianity and everybody else. Okay, the world in 2050, looks pretty religious, according to Pew's kind of global estimates. So basically, I say, maybe vindicating Stark, the world in 2050 is going to look pretty religious still. All right, so, if you kind of look at it in terms of numbers, right, Christians will continue to grow at roughly the same rate as global population. Meaning that there's going to be almost 3 billion Christians by 2050. And, Muslims will, and this is based on, a lot of Muslim countries having pretty high birth rates. Muslims are going to grow faster than any other major world religion and almost catch up to Christianity, right? There's going to be 2.76 billion Muslims in the world. Christianity's kind of share of the global population will remain about the same, at just under a third, right? 31.4, and Islam, will grow to almost 30%. So they're going to be very much neck and neck. The unaffiliated, their total numbers will increase slightly, right? From 1.13 billion to 1.23 billion. But the global share of the population is essentially going to decline, right? Because the unaffiliated, we talked about this a little bit, but I'll mention it again here. They don't have a lot of children. And that means that they're going to grow at less than the total rate of global population growth. And again, everybody else, like Hindus will become bigger than the unaffiliated as, population growth in India continues. And will ultimately make up a slightly smaller share of the global population, at like 0.1 less, as they are growing slower than Islam and Christianity, but remaining important. And yeah, smaller religious groups, Jews, other religion, and such will stay about where they are or decline, in terms of their shares of the global population. All right. And like I said on the last slide, because non-religious people tend to have lower total fertility rates, right? Lower than replacement, their continued growth, if the great nun engine is going to continue, it really relies on a continued cannibalization of other world religions. So it is really dependent on, the secularization thesis being correct, that modernity is toxic to religion. Otherwise, what Pew predicts, and I think this is likely, is that while the total number of people who identify as unaffiliated is going to grow slightly, between 2010 and 2050, that ultimately it won't keep up with the growth of global population. So they will be a much lower share, a 3% smaller share of the global population by 2050. And this is essentially driven by total fertility rates. Right, so you can kind of see the kind of growth here. You can see the explosive growth, particularly in Islam, or what's predicted. Islam predicted to increase by 1.161 billion people, between 2010 and 2050. Christianity still growing robustly, but growing by less than a billion. It starts out at a higher number, essentially a little bit more than half a billion more people than Islam. But it's growing more slowly. The unaffiliated, right, again, growing, but only by 99 million. So, not keeping pace ultimately with global population growth, and owing then to that smaller percentage of global population. Total fertility by religion, just to illustrate this, right? And remember that replacement fertility is essentially 2.1, right? So any lower than 2.1, you're going to essentially have typically kind of population declines, slowly depending on how low it is. And, anything over 2.1 is you're going to see population growth. So what do you see on this chart, right? The total global population growth number is 2.5. So global population is growing at a pretty incremental rate. Christians, growing by about 2.7, which is very robust, right? That's going to be a pretty rapid growth. However, trailing Muslims in Pew's prediction, right? And then Hindus, growing pretty robustly. Jews growing pretty well as well, 0.2 above replacement. Everything else, including our unaffiliated, are shrinking. Now, I would suggest that these numbers came out a few years ago from Pew, and all the evidence I've seen is that actually this number is probably going to be much lower than 1.7 in terms of total fertility. My guess would be, and I'm not a demographer, so I'm just making a guess, somewhere between 0.9 and 1.3, based on sort of, I've been looking at kind of global fertility numbers. Fertility is crashing all over the world, but for the unaffiliated, it's crashing much more quickly. So I suspect that number will actually end up being much lower, which could, further curtail the growth of the unaffiliated. Which is why, I always say that, if trends continue, this will happen, but trends almost never continue. And so keep that in mind. All right, so I will give one last curmudgeonly word to Rodney Stark, who I've tried to frame to look almost like he's in a stained glass window here. One thing that Stark suggested about these numbers from Pew and kind of global predictions. Stark didn't believe Islam will actually ever surpass Christianity, and I think he may have a point here, because I've been looking at kind of global total fertility rates, and while there's a few Muslim countries, specifically, Pakistan being one of them, the Palestinian territories as well, that have really, really high total fertility. A lot of the Muslim world's total fertility rate is crashing to Western levels, right? Like we're talking like Iran, down below replacement. I think Iran's about 1.6, 1.7. Very big Muslim country. Saudi Arabia is very low. Qatar is very low. Egypt is very low, as are Algeria and Morocco, right? Now, there are obviously some where population is growing more quickly, but it's still declining. The total fertility rate is dropping from, really high numbers like 4 children per woman down into the 2 range in some places. So Islamic fertility is dropping really quickly, and it's just going to be essentially sort of a game of whose fertility drops the most quickly. Will it be Christians or Muslims? So about 10 years ago, Stark already thought that total fertility in Muslim countries was slowing. This is correct. right? And he suspected that it will drop, to below kind of Christians. The other thing he suggests is that for the most part, Christians are better at converting people to their religion than Islam. Islam principally grows, he suggests, through fertility. And Christianity in the modern world principally grows through both fertility and conversion. And Christians, for whatever reason, seem to be better at the conversion part than Muslims are. Not universally, but for the most part. Okay, so these arguments come from Christian Smith's book, Religion, What It Is, How It Works, and Why It Matters, and just some things to kind of close off the course. What will the fate of religion be in the future? And Smith asks, will the religious resurgence of the last quarter of the 20th century continue, right, where in most of the rest of the world outside the West, religion actually surged, or will secular culture overcome religion with skepticism, rationalism, and naturalistic science? Or will religion survive but mutate dramatically under the pressure of technological change, globalization, and cultural evolution? And here I'll give you some of his expectations. Okay, so what Smith says is that some, he thinks many, but maybe not many humans will continue to want to practice religion. Now, for a lot of these people, what they want is low intensity religion, right? Not everybody wants to be a sort of religious fanatic, or someone who is participating in demanding religion. Some will want those more intense forms of religion, however. So there's going to continue to be a balance. Humans, he says, will continue to experience challenges they can't independently deal with, and for which they want superhuman assistance, right? That they want to pray to a deity in hoping that something happens. Many people will turn to religion looking for its secondary products that he says are identity, community, meaning, expression, aesthetics, ecstasy, control, and legitimacy of various kinds. Now, what he suggests, right, is that, opposed to Steve Bruce, who suggests that religion is a special product, Smith, and I think he's correct here, says a totally secular existence is not a human default, right? It emerges in particular social conditions, right? It can happen, but it hasn't been the norm for human beings. Most people are religious in some way. And, you have to have a particular set of social conditions for secularity or a total secular order to emerge, right? And if those conditions change, right, then you're going to get a resurgence. Now you can think of, perhaps say, though it's not a perfect example, of the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union, though I don't think it was ever totally secular because obviously, there were other things going on and people still had religious beliefs. The social conditions, right, in terms of what the state demanded, what being religious meant in terms of a lack of opportunity, ultimately led to, we could say, as close to a total secular existence as we've probably seen. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, those social conditions changed, and there was, in some ways, though I don't want to overstress it, a resurgence in religion in Russia. Okay, so you might get a secular order seeming to rise, and then social conditions change, and a return to religion. It's very, very possible, right? All right, what Smith says though is, regardless of anything, there are going to be different social conditions in different parts of the world, and many humans will continue to practice religion for the foreseeable future. And we're going to make new religions, right? New religions will, and kind of sect variations off the religions that we have, are going to continue to rise. Eventually, right, you might see something like Mormonism happen. You'll probably all be dead, as will I. But your children and your grandchildren, if you have any, may live to be in a world where a religion that is founded, sometime in your lifetime will grow to be the next world religion. Now, it takes a while, right? Mormonism was founded essentially in the 1820s, and it took probably about a century and a half for it to enter the ranks, I think, of the youngest world religion, but it's definitely there now. So, I mean, most of you will live to be 80, 90, maybe over 100, given the advances in medicine that are likely to happen in your lifetimes. So you may very well live to see, kind of the bubbling rise of new religious movements that eventually become global religions. Now, most religions die out over time. Most of them don't make it. But you may grow to see some. Yeah, and Smith says, and I think this is prescient, all living religions will be internally, qualitatively transformed over time. Even if some of them make claims to unchanging orthodoxy, right? And here, like, Catholicism is not the religion that it was in the Middle Ages, right? It has been transformed by its encounter with modernity, for good or for ill. Islam as well, right? Every form of Islam, every form of Protestantism have been changed, and they will continue to do so, right? Because they respond to social conditions as well. Yeah, some religions are going to grow in size and significance while others decline, right? The main line took it on the chin from late modernity, and they've declined in their size and strength. Others have grown, right? Islam has become much more powerful and much more prominent. Catholicism is kind of on the bubble. Evangelical had a big rise, and now it looks like it might be into a stage of decline. But as they adapt and kind of shift in modernity, things are going to happen that are hard to predict. Right. Religion will continue to be a significant part of human life and societies as long as the human condition is like what it is now, right? We are human beings. We are very much unchanged from antiquity. We live in a more technologically advanced world, but we still struggle. We still have challenges, right? There are still things that religion does for us. And unless, human beings are transformed by our own technologies, right? If you want to think of Harari's idea of Homo Deus, where we're all going to implant ourselves with chips and, give ourselves pig DNA so we smell better, or, eliminate all, negative things in our genetic code or whatever. As long as that doesn't happen, right, religion will continue to be, and as long as our societies have inequalities, right, and all of these things, religion is going to stick around. In some circumstances, it'll be more powerful. In others, less. It's extremely unlikely that it disappears entirely. And one of the things, and I'll sort of end with this, one of the things that I think is quite interesting that Smith talks about is that the social conditions in one place that might lead to, secularization, in another place might lead to religious growth. And he thinks here specifically of something like religious pluralism. Right. And here I think, Smith is sort of interesting in what he says. And I'm still sort of grappling with this idea. So maybe it's a good place to leave the class. One of the things he says, right, is in particular conditions, let's say religious pluralism, right? It's been argued by both secularization theorists that it's bad for religion because it gives more options, right? More ideological and intellectual systems. And also that it's by market theorists that it's good for religion, right? That more pluralism means there are more choices, right? That more people can find a religion that appeals to them. And what Smith says is that this is true in both cases. In some cases, religious pluralism actually does lead to secularization. In other cases, religious pluralism leads to a more vibrant religion. And sometimes that actually might be more like a light switch than anything else, right? So you can look at the American experience, for example, and say, through the period, from 1776 to 2005, religious pluralism was really helpful to American religion, right? As it was more pluralistic, it gave more brands, more offerings, and more people started going to church, so that by 2005, it was essentially at its highest point. However, it's also equally true in some senses that, the following decades, the 2000s and the 2010s, religious pluralism may have actually turned out to be a net negative for religion, right? Because the social conditions changed a little bit, right? We got new generational cohorts, more immigrant communities, right? A different kind of ideological framework, right? With post-structuralism and postmodernism being promulgated through elite institutions. And because those social conditions had changed a little bit, ultimately, we saw shifts in the religious landscape in a kind of generally downward direction. So I think that's really interesting. Um, you know, Maybe all of our theories, and again, I'm kind of grappling with this after reading Smith's book again and sort of realizing the implications. Maybe our theories are less definitive than we want them to be, and what actually is going on is much more complex and interesting. And sometimes the conditions in one place and time that might lead to religious thriving may actually lead um, to a collapse in religious adherence in another place and time. And it could be the same place, but a different time. So the social conditions that surround, might play a huge role in this. So I'll leave it there. We're going to see religion for a long time. Um, yeah, well, that'll be the course. All right, my dear young friends. So it is now time to say goodbye. This is the end of the course. I wanted to leave you with something, hopefully a little inspirational. And I always think of this quote from St. John Paul II at World Youth Day in 2002 in Toronto. And I remember watching this on TV as it was happening, and loving this particular sort of quote and saying from John Paul. And he said, although I've lived through much darkness under harsh totalitarian regimes, I've seen enough evidence to be unshakably convinced that no difficulty, no fear is so great that it can completely suffocate the hope that springs eternal in the hearts of the young. You are our hope. The young are our hope. Do not let that hope die. Stake your lives on it. So, I hope you go forward in hope. I hope this class has been something you enjoyed, something that you've learned from, and I hope to see you all again or hear great things that you are doing at some point in the future. Goodbye.